Mr. President, I rise today in sadness and somewhat perplexed, because what we're doing in this colloquy is recreating a statement, a letter, as the senator from Minnesota outlined, that was sent by 6 of our predecessors in December of 1986, warning about the dangers of climate change, warning about what this can do to our country and to our world, about costs, and about how we had to take action. One of those senators was George Mitchell of Maine, one of the great legislators of the 20th century. I'm honored to be in the seat that once was occupied by George Mitchell and also by his predecessor, Edmund Muskie. And I think the story of the major environmental legislation of the 20th century, sponsored principally at the beginning by Edmund Muskie, the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, is worth mentioning, if only briefly. The most important point is that the Clean Air Act, one of the most important and comprehensive environmental pieces of legislation in our nation's history, passed this body unanimously. It passed this body unanimously. And Mr. President, it disturbs me that we couldn't agree on the time of day around here unanimously these days. I don't know when this issue became a partisan issue, but I deeply regret it because it is causing harm to our country. What I'd like to do is step into George Mitchell's shoes for a moment and read a statement that he himself wrote and made back in 1986. And you're not going to believe how prescient this statement is. It could have been written yesterday. Here are George Mitchell's words. The problem of global warming is one of immense significance. It is the most serious and more pressing than anticipated. Previously, most of the models forecasting the rate of global warming focused on the air pollutants produced by the combustion of fossil fuel. More recent data suggests that trace gases may also increase the rate of warming by a factor of 2. This means that warming may increase at twice the rate previously thought. The data produced to date suggests that there may be an average increase in temperature of 1 degree centigrade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This was in 1986. We're now at about 1.5 degrees centigrade. Considering how much warmer this June has been than average, a 1 degree difference may appear to be insignificant, but an average of 1 degree increase could be devastating, so the experts tell us. A 1 degree increase in the average global temperature would melt glaciers. That's happening. And such melting would increase the sea level. That's happening. There are uncertainties in predicting how much sea level would increase in a particular area. In some cases, it could be an average increase of a few feet. In others, much more. For a coastal state like Maine, and to other states along the coastline, such an increase would be devastating. And Mr. President, to deviate from George's words for a moment, this is what we see happening. We are now seeing what are called rainy day floods, flooding in areas of our country along the coast that were rare 6-month events are now every high tide. George Mitchell says an average of 1 degree increase in temperature could have major impacts on agriculture. This country's Midwestern breadbasket could again become a dust bowl. More heat would mean less water for crops and variations in growing seasons. It's important to keep in mind that this average increase is global in nature. It is not a national or regional problem. If American farmers suffer for lack of water, so will farmers all over the planet. If shorelines along our coasts are flooded, so will shorelines everywhere in the world. The enormity of this phenomenon is staggering, and we have a responsibility to limit emissions of pollutants that trap the heat in our atmosphere. As difficult, as immense, and as seemingly remote as the problem is to our daily lives, we cannot delay. This was George Mitchell in 1986. We cannot delay. There will be those who argue that more research is necessary to completely understand the phenomenon and to answer every scientific question. We are still hearing that argument today. We need more science, we need more studies, we're not sure. George goes on, and in the case of acid rain, such complete understanding will come only after we flounder in the weight of our short-sighted policies. This is one more indication that the benefits of industrialization carry with them the burden of controlling pollutants. These pollutants threaten our lakes, fish, health, and forests today in the form of acid deposition. We will hear today that these pollutants also threaten the future of our planet, which cannot tolerate such a sudden and dramatic increase in temperature and survive in a form familiar to us. George Mitchell in 1986 said, "Solutions are possible and available." The statement released at the conclusion of the Villach Conference in Austria last October, this was in 1985, addresses the common nature of some of our environmental problems. That statement said in part that climate change and sea level rises due to greenhouse gases are closely linked with other major environmental issues such as acid deposition and threats to the Earth's ozone shield, mostly due to changes in the composition of the atmosphere by human activity. Reduction in coal and oil use and energy conservation undertaken to reduce acid deposition will also lower concentration of greenhouse gases. Reductions in emissions of chlorofluorocarbons, which we achieved, will help protect the ozone layer and will also slow the rate of climate change. The rate and degree of future warming could be profoundly affected by governmental policies on energy conservation, use of fossil fuels, and the emission of greenhouse gases. Those words were written 32 years ago. The rate and degree of future warming could be profoundly affected by governmental policies on energy conservation, use of fossil fuels, and the emission of greenhouse gases. The testimony that they were intending to hear at the hearing that George is describing demonstrated that such governmental policies are needed nationally and on a global basis. And I pause, on a global basis, the tragedy of leaving the Paris Climate Accord, because the only solution to this problem has to be local, national, and global. The testimony from federal agencies will be that the current government policy is to conduct more research, a familiar refrain on issues of this type. What is missing in the federal effort is action. George Mitchell said, what is missing in the federal effort is action. The problem of global warming brings another round of scientists before us decrying the folly of waiting until it is too late to prevent irreversible damage. In the case of acid rain, research has been offered as a substitute for much needed action. This policy has produced more bodies of water that cannot sustain life, more trees that are dying, and more people who find it hard to breathe. The policy has produced more studies, not any meaningful change in policy. George said, I hope that the hearings that they were about to have will help persuade the administration and the people of the country that inaction has its own costs, almost invariably higher than the cost of action. George Mitchell was right. The cost of inaction is invariably higher than the cost of action. George concluded by saying I represent a state that already has been affected by acid deposition. I want to do all I can to keep Maine, the rest of our country, and our planet from facing potentially more dramatic environmental damage from global warming. The best way to avoid these undesirable outcomes is to begin taking action now to prevent further damage, rather than spending twice as much time and later money repairing damage. George Mitchell was right in 1986. Tragically, he's even more right today because we did not heed his call. We did not take action. We have avoided action. I don't want to be the generation that our children and grandchildren look back on and say, where were you and what did you do when the climate was deteriorating, when the glaciers were melting, when the ice sheets were melting, when the sea level was rising, when the storms were increasing intensity, when the wildfires were burning our states? What did you do, Senator? I, for one, want the answer to be, I took action. The answer should be, we took action. This is a challenge today, even greater, significantly greater than it was in 1986. But the very fact that people like Quentin Burdick and George Mitchell and John Chafee and Bob Stafford and David Durenberger saw the future and predicted it so succinctly and profoundly should spur us to the type of action that's necessary to meet, confront, and overcome this most serious of challenges before us. Thank you, Mr. President.